look what we've done with Jesus. If you listen to the passage in Matthew, it begins with John proclaiming Jesus as God, as the one with the winnowing fork in his hand. John is preaching everywhere. Oh, God's going to get you. If you don't straighten up your ways, God is going to get you. If you don't start doing right, God is going to get you. God's winnowing fork, that's a farm term for us city folks, is in God's hand. The wheat will be thrown up in the air and the chaff will fall away. The wheat God will bring into the barn. I guess there's a barn up in heaven. And the chaff God will burn with fire. Everything John was preaching was preparing for God's arrival. And who shows up? Jesus. Jesus shows up at the River Jordan to be baptized by John. John had been saying, all you sinners, come and be baptized. Be baptized for repentance of sins so that you will be fit for the empire of God. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees show up, and he says, who warned you, you brood of vipers, you snakes in the grass? Who warned you to come and receive this baptism that you might be fit? Sometimes the worst thing to happen is when our enemies get right, and we lose our enemies. So John was not happy, but yet he had been called out to baptize those who were ready to change their lives to be fit for a new way of life called the empire of God, in which justice ruled, in which love ruled. But in preaching this repentance, Jesus shows up. And this, for the early church, was a scandal. How could the perfect Jesus, how could the incarnate God need to be baptized? And each of the Gospels and later early Christian writers would wrestle with how to explain what they could not deny, that Jesus had been baptized by John, and yet hold out and hold forth a Jesus who was sinless, perfect, and in fact, God incarnate. This very human image of Jesus. All this bluster and all this talk by John, and a simple Jesus shows up and kneels for baptism. And John is just flustered. Wait, you're the one. You're the one that we were supposed to be delivered by. How is it that you come for baptism? So this very human image of Jesus still peeks through the layers upon layers of the high Christology that the church has put on top of him. The entire controversy about the baptism of Jesus reveals how critical this process became in the church, how necessary it was for them to explain away this human side of Jesus that submitted to the baptism of John. They could not carry forth the project of the church on the shoulders of a human Jesus, and so they had to fix him up, broaden his shoulders a bit so that he could carry the weight of the world and the sins of the world on his shoulders. Even after Jesus prevails and John relents and baptizes him, the author of the gospel can't resist but closing the episode with the coronation of Jesus. And the heavens opened, and the Spirit of God descended like a dove and landed on Jesus. And a voice from the sky said, I guess that's the big guy in the sky, the voice from the sky said, "This is my Son." That is the coronation of Jesus. Not only that, if you look at the imagery more carefully, you can see how all of our ideas about heaven being up there are now invested in Jesus down here. And he becomes Emmanuel, God with us. I guess they got tired of waiting for the big guy in the sky to do what they needed done. And so they invested in this very human Jesus. All their hopes and dreams of deliverance, as they had known to sing about in Psalm 124, invested it in him that brought all of their hopes and dreams of heaven and said, it is now here in this person, and proclaimed him God with us. But if we think the baptism of Jesus was a scandal, what in the world will we do with the crucifixion? Reg sang The Old Rugged Cross. Don Cupid, in his book, After God, has some reflections on the cross as well that I'd like to share with you right now. He says, but now the hitherto almost forbidden human point of view becomes established by deferring objectivity. Previously, it talked about how the human being becomes unimportant as religious ideas evolve to understand or to think that the real, the perfect, is somewhere out there, that God is somewhere out there, and that we human beings have our only purpose in life to approach God, to reach God, to find out what we're supposed to do for God, and therefore we become perfected in that process as we move toward this destination somewhere else. Cupid says that at a certain point, human beings began not to, and said in that process of objectivity, human beings only saw themselves from this kind of mirror view. We looked at ourselves as God looks at us, from this outside, external, objective perspective. Then he says, at a certain point, human beings began not to look at ourselves from the outside, but to look at the world from the inside, from the human point of view, and looking out. And when that subjective view began to take hold, we saw our world quite differently. When we looked only from our human eyes at what we saw, we didn't see perfection. We saw the misery. We saw the pain. We saw the catastrophe that so often afflicted human life, and that affected our theology. So back to Cupid. This transference from objective view to subjective view, this probably happened by meditation upon the human suffering of Christ on the cross. Christ himself experienced the withdrawal or deferral of the objective reality of God. The objective reality of God was supposed to save us. The objective reality of God was supposed to make everything all right. As in Psalm 24, the objective reality of God was supposed to save us from our enemies. But here, Jesus on the cross experiences the deferral of the objective reality of God. Back to Cupid. God had, against all expectation, abandoned him to his own suffering and mortality, and he had cried out in despair. Thus, the merely subjective, only human point of view had become canonized, even legitimated within Christianity itself.